There is this thing that's going on in the West, which I think is very dangerous, which is that when we have an internal social problem, we blame the Russians or the Chinese. The American attitude to China has waxed and waned. It was very hostile, and then there was Nixon in China. Under Kissinger was a great pragmatist about China. And now what we've got is a very, very old-fashioned order where you have basically China and America confronting each other. And I think primarily that is a result of the imperial decline of America. You know, all empires crumble. They crumble quite quickly as well. But they also find it quite difficult to work out what's happening as they're crumbling. China is a rising power, and it is waiting quite patiently for that Western influence to die down. What should be happening is fundamental reassessment by the West of all world relations, and we should be building up, not destroying the UN. And there should be a specific dialogue between America and China. But the forces are pushing China and America away from each other are massive, and that really is a great sadness because we're in a historic transition. But I really do think the West is at a real inflection point at the moment, and that affects everything that happens around it. In a sense, powers like China, Iran, Russia are moving into a vacuum created by the retreat of the West. And so that's all that's happening in that sense. It's not overtly projecting its power, but it is moving into a vacuum. Yes, I think China is playing a very important role in the Middle East, and an increasing one. I don't think it is directly involved yet in actual negotiations, but it's becoming a platform for agreement, which is also quite interesting. China has become a platform for two quite interesting agreements. One was a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was suddenly announced in Beijing by the Chinese between Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia invited China to be the host of a reconciliation agreement with Iran, which is very, very important for the stability of the region. I'm not saying China was involved in the reconciliation itself, but it became a platform for that. And the second time at which it hosted a meeting, which could potentially have been significant, was it hosted all the Palestinian factions, including Fatah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the secular factions as well, for a national unity agreement. Again, it didn't have that much traction on the ground, but China is being used, I think, in that sense as a way of indicating it's used as a message board to America to say, no, you're not the only ones now capable of hosting potentially significant diplomatic moves. China is there for us as well. And that Saudi Arabia chose that, and also that the Palestinian factions chose that, I think is a sign of, I would say, an increasing ability of a non-American actor, a non-Western actor, to mediate. Because one of the things that's happened particularly in the Gaza war, but before that, is that America's lost its role as a mediator. It used to mediate between the two, and there used to be shuttle diplomacy. But America has been so adamant that it will continue to fund Israel that it has lost the power to mediate between the Palestinian factions. It's lost the trust. And so it is an opportunity for other nations to step in and say, right, we will be the honest broker. We will be the one who actually looks for peace and is capable of actually playing a real mediation role. And China has started, it's a long way to go, but it's started to perform that function. We've got into a frame of mind. Basically, what's happened psychologically in terms of the Western mind is that the war has never stopped. First, it was a confrontation between the West and the Soviet Union, a global confrontation. Then it very quickly became a confrontation between the West and Islam, or Islamic fundamentalism, but Islam in general, another global power, nothing like the Soviet Union, but imagined. And now it's become a confrontation between the upholders of democracy, so-called, and authoritarianism, right? Which is classed as China, Russia, Iran, axis of resistance, axis of evil, as they put it. And all of these are powers threatening democracy. There is this thing that's going on in the West, which I think is very dangerous, which is that when we have an internal social problem, we blame the Russians or the Chinese for influencing social media, or for trying to change an election, or for some plot. Technology transfer to China. But somehow there is this sort of feeling that the liberals are have circled the wagon train and are defending themselves against the Indians, and the rest of the world are the Indians, right? Of course, it's an incredibly primitive view, but it's very, very held. In reality, what's happening is that liberal democracy is being eaten away from within, and that the governments are becoming less and less liberal and more authoritarian to hold things down. And that's exactly what happened in the riot, which is an internal cause. It's nothing to do with China or Russia or anything else. It's a completely internal reason. There were scenes of racial hatred not seen since the early 1980s. So I think these riots show how volatile and fragile democracy is in Britain, in Europe. Millions of voters have lost faith in their own governments, and millions of voters have lost faith in the information they get from the mainstream media. Hence the power of social media to put lies out, basically complete misinformation. And the far right are strategically on the march and getting closer and closer to power each time. The more liberal democracy is threatened, the less liberal it becomes. And so the riots sort of were broken with instant and very, very heavy justice. Long prison sentences were given to people who had never fallen foul of the police, had no prison record, and who had never been in trouble with the police. And they're now facing, for social media posts, 3 years in prison. I think what you've got is a lethal combination between migration that was initially encouraged by the government. Even the last government, post-Brexit government, had more immigrants came in than ever before, legally, through student visas and all sorts of other things. So even that government that promised to reclaim control of the borders hasn't reclaimed control of our borders. So you've got a combination of migration and neoliberalism, and the two, i.e. cutbacks always to public services, not enough public housing, not enough council housing, not enough schools in the right area, a shortage of housing, a shortage of good jobs. There are jobs, but there are lots of bad jobs around, and people are having 2 jobs just to make ends, high cost of living, high taxation. You put all that together, and the lowest, and the people who are really angry, not people in London. London's booming because all the economy has gone down to the south. So there's an internal collapse happening. And that's why foreign policy is not subject to really a fundamental review, which it should be. And we've seen a retreat of the state over the past 30 years. So there is a profound crisis going on in what you call Western liberal democracy. And the far right, which is neither particularly Western nor particularly liberal, is coming back up. So again, this may be too pessimistic, but the clearest analogy, historical analogy to where we are now, is 1929, 1928, before a very big war, before a very big depression. That is where we think we are at the moment.